When Richard Allen was arrested in connection with the Delphi murders, many believed that the silence and secrecy of the investigation would finally come to an end, and that 6 years' worth of questions would finally be answered. Instead, what followed was a series of unprecedented moves by the local police and prosecutor to cover up and seal all information surrounding the identification and arrest of Allen, as well as any evidence against him. For 6 years, the men leading the Delphi investigation have been trusted to conduct a thorough, competent, and honest investigation. They have been afforded the benefit of the doubt at every turn in the hopes that eventually justice would prevail. But who are these men, and what makes them so deserving of the public's trust and reverence?
The Indiana Court of Appeals is reviewing a decision to suppress evidence against a Carroll County man to drop all charges on 28-year-old Jessie Snider. Warrants used to search Snider's property were obtained under inaccurate information. Thompson filed a motion to dismiss the case due to insufficient evidence.
On October 27, 2007, Indiana Conservation Officer Todd Peckney was patrolling a Carroll County road when he heard small-caliber rifle fire. Peckney drove around trying to pinpoint the location of the shots and saw a group of people standing around laughing outside a nearby home. Peckney spent the next hour surveilling the individuals and the property through binoculars. The home belonged to 27-year-old Army veteran Jessie Snider. Although he had witnessed nothing illegal occurring on the property, Officer Peckney requested that additional officers be dispatched. Shortly before midnight, a Flora police sergeant and a Carroll County deputy arrived to assist. With weapons drawn, the officers approached the property and ordered the men out of the garage at gunpoint. Peckney asked the homeowner, Jessie Snider, about the gunshots and what they had been doing. Snider denied that any shots were fired and explained that he and his friends were playing paintball in his pole barn and were using firecrackers to signify the start of each round. Snider and his friends were then marched back to the pole barn at gunpoint. The officers lined them up with their hands behind their heads and their ankles crossed and patted them all down for weapons. When one of the officers entered the barn and began to search inside, Snider stood up in protest and told the officers that they did not have his permission to go through his barn. Additional officers arrived on scene to assist in the unlawful search of Snider's property, including DNR Officer Dan Doolin and Carroll County Detective Kevin Hammond. In order to obtain a search warrant, officers falsely claimed that they had reason to believe that there was marijuana and other illegal drugs inside Snider's residence. A warrant was issued authorizing the search of the pole barn and one vehicle, but not of the residence or any outbuildings. Despite the judge refusing to authorize a search of the inside of Snider's residence, DNR officers and Carroll County Sheriff's Office deputies entered his home and conducted what they called a safety sweep. When several marijuana plants were found inside the residence, the officers went before a second judge in a different county to obtain a search warrant of the home. Jessie Snider was arrested, incarcerated, and charged with a number of felonies and misdemeanors, including possession of destructive devices and possession of a machine gun. It would later be revealed that Snider did not in fact possess any destructive devices, nor were any machine guns found during the search of his property. Snider was held in the Carroll County Jail on a $100,000 bond. After reviewing the facts of the case, a Carroll County judge determined that the officers had unlawfully detained and searched Jessie's home and property, despite lacking any reasonable suspicion or probable cause to do so. The judge ordered that any evidence obtained during the unlawful raid was inadmissible, and all charges against Jessie were ultimately dismissed. The local news labeled Jessie a homegrown terrorist and slandered his reputation in video segments and in print. Even though no crime had been committed and all charges were dropped, Jessie was fired from his job at the post office after DNR officer Dan Doolin contacted Jessie's supervisor. In his letter to the post office, Doolin repeatedly misrepresented the facts and embellished the case against Jessie, going so far as to suggest that Jessie was a terrorist who harbored anti-US sentiments. As a result, Jessie was unable to secure stable employment and ultimately lost the home he had purchased a year earlier. What started as an innocent night of paintball with friends turned into a nightmare that would disrupt and utterly destroy the life Jessie had so nobly built.
Welcome to Amber Light, where we keep the amber porch light shining brightly into the darkness for justice, especially for Abby and Libby, but for those that are also victims everywhere against power and corruption. The Incorruptible Delphi Police, Part 2. You've just seen a video that was produced by Corey Rowe, and it was published on the R&M Productions YouTube channel, highlighting the story of Jessie Snider. I don't think I have to comment too much on it at the moment because that video does a really great job of documenting the story. But yes, Jessie Snider was arrested wrongfully. His case was dismissed because the police overstepped their authority by searching his property without the proper warrants. And several officers were named in the video as being complicit and partners in this really unjust event that sadly, ultimately, ended up in Jessie Snider losing his job. He had to move to a new community, and he spiraled into a deep darkness and ultimately died of an overdose. The Incorruptible Delphi Police certainly have negatively impacted the family of Jessie Snider and himself. They named some names. I'm going to focus on two in this video. Dan Doolin was one of the officers that was involved. And one that wasn't named in the video, however, I'll show you later. It comes up in the court documents, the court records. Jason Dunning. Dan Doolin and Jason Dunning. Keep both of those officers in mind. I think next I'm going to move to the documents where Jessie Snider had sued and pursued civil action against these officers who wrongfully arrested and detained him. Let's check those out. I have the case text website here of Snider versus Peckney. Peckney was the officer, if you recall in the beginning of the video, he was the one who was surveilling the property and heard alleged gunshots. So he's named in the lawsuit by Snider. We'll start with a summary from John DeGulio, District Judge. While on a routine nighttime patrol in Carroll County, Indiana, Conservation Officer Todd Peckney heard small caliber rifle shots coming from what turned out to be Jessie Snider's property. Peckney suspected deer poaching, but his subsequent investigation uncovered a stockpile of firearms, a stash of bomb-making materials, and a marijuana grow operation. The state dismissed all criminal charges after a circuit court judge in Carroll County suppressed all the evidence uncovered during the search of Snider and his property. But Snider lost his job with the Postal Service. Snider filed this lawsuit against everyone involved in the investigation, the prosecution, and the termination of his employment. I've skipped down to where the defendants tell their side of the story. The defendants in this case are the police. So you have to keep that in mind. It could be confusing. After they had questioned Snider and Hokema, the officers and Snider and Hokema was another one of the friends of Snider that was there, walked over to the pole barn about 60 yards away from the garage. Snider led them to a large barn, turned on the lights, and told them to go ahead and look in the barn. Peckney stepped in and looked around, but didn't see anyone, and then stepped out. He then walked around the back of the barn while Bishop, one of the other officers, stayed with Snider. At that point, 6 or 7 people walked from behind the barn toward Peckney. Peckney told them to put their hands up to make sure that they did not have firearms and sent them to stand near Snider. They were all frisked. Peckney and Deputy Dunning, this is Jason Dunning that I told you to keep an eye on. Peckney probably needs to be looked into, but Dunning, I'm focusing on Doolin and Dunning in this episode. Peckney and Deputy Dunning continued to look for other people because they still had not accounted for the 12 individuals and were still trying to figure out what was going on. While Bishop stayed with Snider and the other officers, Peckney and Dunning, went back into the pole barn to see if anyone was hiding in there. Snider did not specifically consent to the second search of the barn, but neither did he object. So Peckney assumed he had consent. During the course of the second sweep of the barn, Dunning discovered a wooden box in plain view that the officers recognize as a dugout that normally contains a pipe and an area that contains marijuana. Peckney believed that the box was drug paraphernalia. I'll stop there. So keep in mind, the court is this. What I've just read is, the defendant's account, the state's account, the police officer's account, and you notice a couple of things. One, they had consent to do the search, at least as they're telling their side of the story. Keep in mind, this was dismissed by a judge because they did not have consent. One other account says that Snider saw them as they were searching. They were looking, all over the place under lawnmowers and things. Dunning found this drug paraphernalia in plain sight, according to their testimony. However, the account of the family and those that were there would agree that the drug, this dugout box, I don't even know what that is, was in a bag. It was not in plain sight. So the officers, they're looking for, poaching, right? Deer poaching. Was there a deer in the bag? Who knows? I'm going to skip down a little further. The conclusion of the lawsuit here. I'm going to go ahead and read it. It's painful to read, but because the officers had reasonable suspicion that Snider and his guests were engaged in unlawful deer hunting, I don't know how they never established how they drew that conclusion. From hearing gunshots, which were likely actually firecrackers, and they draw the conclusion that there's deer poaching happening there. But hey, the guests were engaged, they suspected, in unlawful deer hunting. And perhaps, it's a big word, perhaps they don't have any reasonable cause here. Other reckless and dangerous behavior potentially associated with repeated gunshots fired at night. Is that in and of itself illegal activity? Is that a crime to be on your own property with your friends, lighting off firecrackers, having a paintball fight? Maybe even if you are out back shooting guns. Is that necessarily illegal behavior? I'm really questioning this. So the summary judgment given by the judge in this lawsuit went in the defendants, in the police officers, the state's favor on all claims other than Snider's claim that Officer Peckney and Deputy Dunning unlawfully searched his pole barn. So he won on that point, which agreed with the court. The evidence was dismissed because they conducted an illegal search. The incorruptible Delphi police, they never do anything wrong, just ask them. These officers conducted an illegal search. They didn't have a warrant. They had a limited warrant, but they didn't have the right to go in the barn. They were digging for reasons to find so that they could make arrests. That's what this is all about. Let's talk about Dan Doolin for a minute. Let's focus on him. He was part of this. As it happens, Dan Doolin was also the officer. He's a DNR officer. He was the officer who first spoke with Richard Allen in the Delphi murders case. He was given the tip to go work where Richard Allen had called and said, "Hey, I was out there that day." Dan Doolin went to Richard Allen, arranged a meeting, was the first to make contact. He didn't record the conversation or anything. He just took notes. And Richard Allen allegedly told Dan Doolin that he was on the trails between 1 and 3 that day. At least that's what Dan Doolin wrote in his notebook. Later on, when Richard Allen would be being interviewed by the police, and this was shown in the trial, he stated that he was at the trails that day from 12 to 1:30. One could make the argument, and I get it, that if Richard Allen is truly guilty, that he's going to change timelines for sure. But also, the only official record that we have stating that he was at the trails during the time of the murders, the only connection that is made to Richard Allen as being potentially there is the testimony of Dan Doolin.
Dan Doolin said, "Well, let's meet at your house or the law enforcement building." And Richard Allen said, "Well, I want to meet. Why don't we meet at the grocery store parking lot?" Now, the witness Doolin said, "Well, that kind of stuck out to him because it was odd that he didn't want law enforcement to come to his house or perhaps to meet at law enforcement." On cross-examination, they said that the question was, "Well, didn't he tell you that he was literally on his way to the grocery store and he met with you within an hour of the time that you called him? So this was the fastest possible way. He was like coming into town and just, let's meet at the grocery store. I'm headed there anyway." So, and the defense also talked about the fact that maybe some people don't want law enforcement coming in their home, and not just because they're guilty, but just because they feel uncomfortable with that, or maybe they don't want to go to the law enforcement office. Maybe that feels eerie or uncomfortable. So he was on the trail from roughly, well, initially 1 to 3 p.m., but he adjusted that to the time of 1:30 to 3:30.
That was Lawyer Lee, one of the lawyers that was present during the trial. Since there wasn't really any media allowed, you kind of had to rely on these accounts, these eyewitness accounts about what was happening in the courtroom. And she noted that Dan Doolin kind of the timeline was a bit questionable. Was it 1 to 3? Was it 1:30 to 3:30? Again, later on, Allen testified that he arrived at 12 to 1:30. We're really dependent upon the testimony of Dan Doolin here. Now, keep in mind, Dan Doolin is the same man who wrote the letter to the post office for Jessie Snider. This is strange to me. Dan Doolin, they conduct an illegal search. That case gets thrown out of court because it was an illegal search without a warrant. And then does Dan Doolin retaliate for some reason? Does he write a letter to the post office, the supervisor of Jessie Snider? And in this letter, he embellishes the story. He doesn't seem to tell the whole truth. It's character assassination. And that ultimately kind of contributed to Jessie's firing and his ultimate demise. You see, these officers, they do things, but their actions have consequences. And if Dan Doolin is willing to fudge the numbers a little bit on a case like Jessie Snider, is he also willing to fudge the numbers a bit on a case like Richard Allen? Now, let's turn to the other officer who was involved in this, Jason Dunning.
A Carroll County deputy is on administrative leave tonight, charged with trying to solicit sex from a couple last month. A special prosecutor charged Carroll County Sheriff's Department Deputy Jason Dunning with making an unlawful proposition for the incident that happened late in August. Carroll County Sheriff Toby Lisenby said Dunning was off duty at the time of the alleged incident. Dunning has been placed on administrative leave, and the case is being handled by the Clinton County Special.
From the Carroll County comment published October 4th of 2017, this was several years after the Jessie Snider case, but during the year or later in the year during the Delphi murders case, bar incident turns into charges for county deputy. A 46-year-old Carroll County Sheriff's Department deputy, Jason Allen Dunning, was charged September 29th in Carroll Superior Court with making an unlawful proposition, a Class A misdemeanor. According to court records, Dunning did knowingly or intentionally offer to pay or agree to pay money or other property to this woman, I'm not going to say her name, she's the victim, on the understanding that the other person will engage in sexual intercourse or other sexual conduct with Dunning on or about August of 27th this year. Charges were filed by Special Prosecutor Anthony Summer of Clinton County. Dunning has been a deputy with Carroll County since actually July of 2007. Previously, he spent 11 years in the Marine Corps. He also serves as the Camden Town Marshal and is a part-time officer for the city of Delphi. So Jason Dunning is a seasoned veteran of the police. He's a town marshal. He helps support the city of Delphi. And he's engaging in activity that he knows is illegal. The incorruptible Delphi police. At least in this case, justice seems to maybe have been done. I'm going to say maybe, very loosely. Here's a later article by the Carroll County comment published in May of 2018. Former deputy pleads guilty. So former deputy, he has now been fired, I would imagine, I would hope, at least at this time. I'll just kind of skim through this a little bit. 46-year-old Jason Allen Dunning of Camden was charged last September with making an unlawful proposition the month before the charge was filed by the prosecutor we named earlier. A question: would that have happened if it was a Delphi prosecutor? I don't know. Clinton County is not too far away from Carroll County, but maybe because it was in a different county, it was handled right. I don't know. Dunning was a county deputy at the time of his arrest. We've read that before. I'll skip on down here a little bit. He was off duty when all this happened. He did, he pled guilty. His punishment, let's see if I can find that here. Okay, here it is. Carroll County Circuit Court Judge Benjamin Diener accepted Dunning's plea agreement. So there was a plea. Pursuant to the agreement, the court entered a judgment of a conviction as a Class A misdemeanor. Dunning was sentenced to 180 days in the Carroll County Jail, which were suspended. He was placed on probation upon written terms and conditions for the 180 days. So there it is. Jason Dunning, who was complicit and participatory in the Jessie Snider case, not so clean himself. It raises questions, doesn't it, about the character of our police officers. Now, I've said it before in other videos. Please don't think that I'm anti-police, because I'm not. I think that most officers do a pretty good job, but it sure seems to me like in Carroll County, the odds are against us. Again and again and again, we see corruption. And that's very concerning about whether or not justice has truly been delivered in the case of Abby and Libby. And if Richard Allen is truly guilty or not.
How about we start to heal now? How about we hit that reset button and understand that justice in this country was served, and if you don't like justice in this country, go do another one. Let's heal. Tone down the rhetoric. Stop all the politics and all the nonsense and all the conspiracy theories, and understand that we all tried the best we could. That should be the message to us and to our kids, and to this most amazing place we call the United States of America.